Shabbat Shalom. Good to see you guys today. It's been a kind of a strange week for us, and it sounds like you had some strange weeks as well. But we always know that on Shabbat, we can put that behind us and we can press forward to the next week, because as we encamp today, so shall we journey in the week to come. The Torah portion today was Teitze, when you go out. And the traditional reading is Deuteronomy 21:10 through 25:19, Isaiah 54, 1 through 10. Today, from that, we read Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 6, and 24, 17 through 22, Ecclesiastes 5:1, Proverbs 6, and if you have time and you haven't read it recently, Proverbs 31 will go along with this. And for the Brit Chadashah reading, 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16, and 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 15. So what I'm going to attempt to do this morning is something I've wrestled with a little bit, because it's kind of the end of something that I've been working with for the past several weeks. And as I came to the end, I realized that really kind of the fun stuff was in the past lessons. Today's lesson, it didn't seem like there was anybody to teach to. In other words, I'm teaching on something that I really don't believe our congregation at this point has a problem with. I don't think we have a problem with people who won't get up and go to work and earn their own bread. I don't think we have a problem with busybodies. I don't think we really have a problem with our marriage relationships. So, I wasn't really sure what to do, but as I was studying Proverbs, and especially that passage that says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard," I at some point, I don't know what I was listening to. I've tried to rack my brain to think, what was I listening to when I heard this? I heard someone say, he can sell ants to a picnic. And I thought, I've heard of somebody that can sell refrigerators to an Eskimo, but I had never heard that someone could sell ants to a picnic. But that's what I'm going to attempt to do today. I'm going to try to sell ants to a picnic, because I don't think you need any ants. I think you're on top of this portion, but for some reason, and then when June said that about we're just little ants on the ground, I thought, there's something in here for someone. And I don't know what it is. I don't know, if we're ants or what's going on. So we'll go through this portion, and if it helps you, great. Maybe it was meant for someone out there in the Israelnet. I don't know. But like I said, this is a kind of a finishing up point. We've looked at some people who keep popping up in the Torah portions. And it's the stranger, it's the orphan, it's the widow, and so forth. And we've talked about who we share our first fruits with. I spent a lot of time on that. But just on a personal level and a congregational level, have you ever wondered, really, who are we obligated to support? It's not so clear because we're not in the land. And even as we read this Torah portion, it's not that specific. I mean, we deal with things called unemployment and welfare and food stamps and these sorts of things, and it gets really fuzzy and cloudy at some point. Should I be supporting this person who's fallen on hard times? Should I not be supporting them? Should the congregation support them? Obviously, Paul's instructions were a lot more clear. And like there I say, I don't think this congregation has a problem with giving to people in need. I think we actually give more than what Scripture would require us to do, possibly even to the point where we're actually breaking a commandment that says if they won't work, you don't feed them. That's a hard thing to accept, but that's what the Scripture says. Let's try to go back to this Torah portion and see if we can kind of redefine what we're doing here. Remember, along the way, the thread, the symbol has been bread, because that's just the way I chose to lay the foundation, because bread is not only our daily food, it's also used as a synonym for money. And I still hear people use bread for money. I'm not sure why. They're lost in the 70s or something. I don't know. But, man, you got any bread? And I don't know if they mean like challah or money. But I think that might have been something that's been handed down through the generations. We see bread as some sort of currency. And remember, the first 3 mentions of bread that we went over is, number 1, it's work. After the sin, Adam was told, okay, now you're going to work and it's not going to be fun. You're going to toil and you're going to sweat and it's not going to be fun because you're going to have thorns and thistles to deal with from now on. That's the first time bread was mentioned. The fact that our work would be unpleasant on this earth. Whatever we did to earn our bread was not necessarily going to be a job we loved. The fellowship meal was the second mention. And it's used as an act of worship and tithing first fruits with like-minded believers. Remember, we went back to Abraham and Melchizedek, the bread and the wine. And then the third mention was hospitality to the stranger or to the traveler. These are the first 3 mentions of bread in Scripture. And like I said, we've looked at the fellowship meal in quite a bit of detail. So what we're going to do in this portion is to look more closely at the human obligation to work and demonstrate hospitality to travelers that the Torah defines as truly needy. Not as we're defining them, because as I said, I think sometimes our definition's getting a lot bigger than what the Torah is. We're including a lot of people that, if you read those requirements of who Paul considered a widow, our definition is much broader. But we need to get it right, because James said, pure religion and undefiled is this: to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep yourself unspotted from the world. So, if we want to practice a pure religion, it would behoove us to figure out who the orphan and who the widow actually are, and make sure that we are supporting them according to the Scripture. This is so important, because if we turn away those who are truly needy according to the Torah, listen to what it says in Ezekiel 16:48. As I live, declares the Lord God, Sodom, your sister, and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, careless ease, but she did not help the poor and the needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. We don't want to be removed. We don't want to turn away from those who are truly poor and needy. Just because we have plenty to eat, we should be careful that we don't turn away from the cries of those who don't have enough to eat. We should not be that arrogant and say, this is God's blessing and that must be God's judgment since they don't have enough. That's not true. We have to use His definitions. And we're going to have to struggle with to whom we give sustenance. Who are these truly needy people in our communities, and how do we provide for them? There's no question that the truly disabled person should be supported by his spiritual community. There's no question about it. At this point, like I say, with our government the way that it is, the taxpayers support those who are truly disabled. But maybe one sign of the times is that how difficult it is to get on disability even when you are truly disabled, because there are so many who try to get on it who are not. The dishonesty, you see, where there's no sin, there's no law. But the more we sin, the more laws we have, and the harder it is for the truly needy to obtain what they need. If we did not support those who truly could not provide for themselves, if they had no way possible to help themselves, then it would bring Elohim's wrath upon the community, just as it did upon Sodom. Some people, they just need an extra hand. They're in a time of trouble. They may have had their house burned down. They may have lost a job unexpectedly. Some people need that extra help for a temporary time. But as we go farther into the Scriptures, we're going to see that there's a lot of people out there who pose themselves as a needy person, but they are not. Not according to God's definition of needy. And we are even forbidden to support them. It's not a matter of whether we want to. Paul says don't do it. In fact, separate yourself from that person who's going around, an able-bodied person who refuses to work. There are some who are not to be supported by the congregation. They are to be supported by their own families, not by us. Again, our difficulty is that not all of our families walk within the covenant, so they may not feel that obligation to provide for their parents. They may not feel that obligation to provide for a close relative. It's so confusing and it's so difficult. But as believers and as a congregation, to share our bread is part of our covenant obligation. When you signed up for the Torah and you said, I want my name on that covenant, then you took that obligation on yourself to help the truly needy. But we have to separate what defines a Torah congregation, a covenant congregation, from an evil assembly. There's an evil congregation, there's a righteous congregation. In our Torah portion, it says that an Ammonite or a Moabite cannot enter the righteous assembly until the 10th generation. Remember, 10 is the number of a congregation, the number of an assembly. Why? What was their problem? Why were they prevented from entering a righteous assembly for 10 generations? He says, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt. Hospitality to the traveler, to the stranger, to the one in need is very high on Adonai's list. He says even people who live outside of the covenant have an obligation to help those who are in need, even if it's not a close blood relative. This lack of hospitality, this lack of providing bread and water to needy people, they missed not only an opportunity, they became part of an evil congregation. It demonstrates that stinginess is sometimes accompanied by evil, harmful words. How do we know that? Because right after he says they wouldn't meet you with bread and water, he says because they hired against you Bilaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. Not only weren't they going to help them out, they hired a sorcerer to come put a curse on them. Adonai expects even heathens to demonstrate hospitality to a traveler. So how much more should the congregation of Elohim provide help to a traveler who's on the road? Not only they didn't feed and fellowship with them, they used evil words against them. Or they tried to. Of course, Adonai didn't let it happen. He turned the curse into a blessing. But hospitality is something that we owe one another whether in or out of the covenant. And he doesn't say that, that Israel left the road and went out into all their cities and started knocking on doors. He said, no, it was those heathen nations' responsibility to meet them in the road with the help. Wow. We're supposed to meet them? That's what it means, meet a need. It means somebody doesn't actually have to come to your house and knock on your door and say, I'm starving. It means you might notice as they walk by they're not doing so well, and that you would meet them in the way with that help. We need to find out who's in need and meet that need. Regardless of wealth, we meet the need of a traveler. How do I know that? But he realized that Abraham was a very wealthy man. Nevertheless, Melchizedek brought out the bread and the wine. It does not matter how much money a traveler has. When they are away from home, we are obligated to help them out, to give them something to eat, to have fellowship with them. And what about angels? Did they really need food? They already had angel food cake, right? Nevertheless, Abraham runs and he makes the meat and the bread and the curds and so forth. He's trying to feed angelic beings. They didn't need it, but he felt obligated to do it because he was part of a covenant. I think that we're very good at this mitzvah. I think we're very good at perceiving when someone is in need of help and trying to meet that need in the road before the person actually has to come and say, we're starving here. There's nothing left on the shelf. So let's resolve to keep on keeping on in this area, to never begrudge a traveler or one another food when we're weary. As we moved on through the Torah portion, it says no less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times that we are to leave the gleanings of our field for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Now, if it said it once, maybe we could overlook it. But if it says it 5 times, from verse 17 to 22, we should try to find out, who are these people? Well, number one, as we're reading through this particular passage, notice something in Deuteronomy 24:17. It's going to reinforce that first mention of bread in Scripture. Remember, the first mention was an association with work. So as we meet the need of these people, whoever they might be, it's not telling us to deliver these sheaves or these grapes or these olives to their mailbox once a month. It's telling us that we are to leave in our fields the gleanings. From what we make, from our labor, from our field, from our business, from whatever, we are to leave something that tells you that whoever these people are, they are expected to get up out of bed in the morning the same way that we do. They are to walk to wherever those gleanings are, and they are to work and sweat and toil the same way that we do as we pick up our part of those fruits. Everybody has to get up and go to work. No one delivered any barley to Ruth. She got out of bed in the morning. She said, Naomi, I'm going to work. And she went to the field and she sweated and she slaved and she stood in the hot sun. And then God rewarded her work because He saw that she took that initiative. She took that step. The stranger, the widow, and the orphan are expected to go to the field and sweat the same way that we do in order to collect their sheaves. You know, it's not easy work to stand in a field and pick up sheaves at that time of the summer. The sun is high, but they said Ruth, she hardly even rested. Took very few breaks. Can you imagine what it takes to beat olives out of a tree? It makes my shoulder hurt just thinking about having to beat a tree hard enough to make fruit fall out of it. And if you're going to pick grapes, you're going to have to fight some wasps. Have you ever noticed how wasps and stinging insects hang around fruit trees? You're going to get stung. If you decide to go out and work, you will be stung, things will fall into your eyes, and you will sweat. You will be uncomfortable. Our food is earned by toil and discomfort. That's what the covenant says. In one respect, I wasn't real crazy about some of the things that FDR did during the Depression, mainly about the way that he treated the Jews during the war. I've got a real problem with that. But he understood something about the Torah. Rather than just hand people a check and a bowl of soup, he created all these programs so men could get out of the house and they could go build bridges and dams and clear out forests and do all sorts of public work so that as they did receive that help, that handout, that they could also salvage their psychological stability. Because remember, we are hardwired to work. And for a man to month after month just come take a check, it does something to him. It does something very negative to him. Now notice that these particular food items that were left as gleanings were not the first fruits. 3 pilgrimage festivals with the widow, the orphan, and with the stranger, we share first fruits. We give them the cream of the crop 3 times a year. They're entitled to those at the festivals of first fruits. It's wine and milk without cost. But if they want to eat the rest of the year with the rest of us, they're going to have to go to the field and they're going to have to work too, even to get the leftovers, even to get what's left after everything else has been picked over. I was watching Dr. Phil one time and he said, if you don't have a job, then your full-time job is looking for a job. And I agree with that. What good does it do to sit at home, with the Lexington Herald Leader watching Dr. Phil, if you're not going to get out and actively try to find that job? Sheaf gleaning, olive beating, and grape pinching may not show up in the classified ads every week. It's been a long time since I've seen those jobs advertised. You're going to have to hit the road each day to find work. In fact, I teach inmates a pre-release class, and it helps them find some techniques for hunting a job, because believe me, if you're an inmate and you're looking for a job, you talk about hard. Because on all the applications it says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? You going to lie or are you going to tell the truth? Well, I say, they have a hard job, and that's finding a job. But I tell them, the best way to get a job is not the classified ads. Very few jobs are filled that way. The best ways to find a job are word of mouth, make contact with people. And number two, even if there's no job advertised at that business, take your resume, go there. If that's where you think you might be able to work, ask to talk to the human resource manager or whoever does the hiring, and tell them you're interested in working there. And here's your resume. And if there's ever anything open, please, give you a call. Would they mind if you stop by, once a month or so just to check in? What does that tell the person? It tells them that you're not sitting at the house watching Dr. Phil. It tells them that even though you don't have a job, you have the initiative to get up and go look for it. You're going to go beat the olive trees until something good drops out. Those are the best ways to find a job. Many of the best jobs are never advertised. They're filled by word of mouth. It's by knowing and contacting the right people. It means that we're not content just to sit there and wait for an opportunity to come to us. We see what needs to be done, and we do it without waiting to be asked. Adonai put this Torah of work for the needy in place for us. He's saying the same thing. He says, if you're an able-bodied Israelite, then you are to keep busy earning your bread in sincerity and quietness. And that's the interesting part. You think, well, I'm busy, I should be quiet, right? No, I've worked with people who might be busy, but man, can they talk. In fact, down at the training center, when I'm running on the treadmill, there's a guy down there, I'm just dying, You're somewhere close to the second mile, and he's over there just, talk. And I'm thinking, you can't be actually working out and still have breath to talk. You can't, which he's not. He's walking. He's pretending to work out. I think he just goes for, the fellowship or something. I don't know. But if you're truly working hard at what you do, you don't have a lot of time to talk, to kind of shoot the breeze or whatever we call it now. If we keep this Torah in its spirit, then it's going to reduce idle time, that bread of idleness, and it's going to reduce gossip time. We do live in a culture where sometimes a poor person expects to receive first fruits all the time, and they expect it delivered. Yes. That's not the way the Torah works. You only get that 3 times a year, And even then you would have to walk to Jerusalem to get the cream of the crop. But our government seems to buy into that, because I've had some of that government cheese before. It's delicious. It's the best stuff you can get. And in a way that's good, because, at some point in your life you are entitled to the first fruits. Even if you're not buying into the Torah covenant, it's good to taste the first fruits, but the government that's the best quality stuff they give away. That can be a good thing. But if you think you're entitled to it on a daily or monthly basis, we might have a problem with the Torah of gleaning. If we keep it faithfully, if we all do what we're called to do according to this, then it ensures that every individual has the opportunity to have food through all seasons. No one has to go hungry if we all do what we're called to do. Yes, it requires much work. Yes, it requires much effort. But if we can be like this ant, a gleaner that gathers and stores food when the opportunity is there, then we can have bread in the winter season when it's not so easy to find that job. He says, look at the ant, lazy bones, and get smart. That's a wonderful way of putting it. If you're a simple-minded person, Solomon makes it simple for you. He says, go outside, find some ants, watch those ants, and you'll be wise. So I did. I went outside and I watched the ants. What am I going to learn from these ants? Well, I noticed for one thing, they're a lot like poor people. They're not planting and sowing crops. They're not starting their own businesses. They're simply taking from the people who have. They are feeding off what someone else has started, what they have sown, and what they have reaped. That's an interesting thing. Because as a poor person, that's really your only option, is to take whatever job is available. Just like the ants, they eat what is available, not what they want. If you drop something on your floor and you don't clean it up within just, a very short time, within a couple of hours, you've got all sorts of visitors in your kitchen, don't you? And if you leave them alone for a while, they'll take every bit of it away for you. Now, they'll probably come back, Now that they found a good thing, they'll probably be back. They'll probably make their home closer to yours. So you'd best go ahead and clean up the mess. But if you've noticed, if you drop something greasy, something sweet especially, they're in there and they're in there fast, and they go tell all their friends. They'll run out there, and you'll see their little ant things kind of rubbing on each other, and I guess that's ant talk for, hey, there's a piece of pie in the kitchen, and they're giving their GPS directions on how you get there. And they'll make that straight line. They don't waste a lot of time. They don't sit there and talk about it. They just give directions and go. They don't sit there and have a long conversation. They don't eat the bread of idleness. They glean non-stop from other people's work, and they store it up for later. They're busy, but they're not busybodies. There's a difference. They go out, they harvest the food, they take it back to the nest, and then there's other ants that process that food, clean the nest, tend the larvae, and allocate the food where it needs to go. And so we're supposed to learn from that. Everybody has a job. Just watch them at work, and they'll clean up a spill really fast. It's diligence. It's being on top of things. It's being, they didn't find that food because somebody called them up and said, hey, pie spilled on the ale wine floor. That's not how they found that job. They found that job because they were out there looking for the pie on the floor. They didn't know it was pie they would find, but they ran into the pie because they were looking for something to eat. On the other hand, it would not seem that the Torah allows us to provide food and clothing for a man or a woman who is able to work and refuses to do so, especially a believer. You notice when the manna fell from heaven, the commandment was not given to the women to go gather it up. Now, I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying that the primary commandment was given to the men specifically of each household, and the man was told to gather as much as you need for your household, according to the number of persons in his tent. And as we read the third chapter, 2 Thessalonians, it told you the same thing, that a man is to go out and he is to earn the bread for his household. In fact, the apostles call this a tradition. Now, I know we don't like the tradition word, but they say this is a tradition that we passed on to you. And this tradition was so important, they passed it on in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. So it was an important tradition. What was this tradition? Well, everything we know points back to a living Torah. So if we're going to find the source of this commandment, of this tradition, and exactly how it is worded, then we're going to have to go back to the pages of the Torah. The text that's being described is a congregation with people who are called disorderly. Now, disorderly conduct, I think of people out brawling on Friday night in a bar somewhere. But this is some sort of disorderly conduct that's going on within a congregation. They weren't brawling at the local saloon. The apostles define what this disorderly conduct is, and they're commanding it to stop. They're not asking, they are commanding it to stop. He says it's someone who is not laboring, who's not earning his own bread. He says, we're the apostles, and we didn't take anybody's bread for nothing. We paid for it. It's a failure to work. It's a failure or a commitment to labor and toil night and day. And those were his exact words, labor and toil night and day. And he goes on to say that the apostles left a commandment with the congregation that if anyone did not follow that example, then that man should not be given food to eat. That's pretty harsh. We don't like to hear that. If somebody won't work, that we don't feed them. It wasn't an encouragement. It wasn't a suggestion. He says it's a commandment. You know, a lot of times congregational leaders today are afraid to be firm in passing along the commandments because people really only want the warm, fuzzy commandments that make them feel good. That didn't make anyone feel good. Anybody in here enjoy hearing that? If you don't work, you're not going to eat, you're going to go hungry? It doesn't give you a warm, fuzzy feeling to pass that on. We are free will worshipers. And if somebody's going to tell us if we don't work, we can't eat, then we will go to a congregation where we can be told that if we don't work, we can eat. Fortunately, this is Torah. This is not us. It's not just a made-up thing. There is a Torah of gleaning that says you have to work for what you eat. You are not permitted to eat someone else's bread if you are an able-bodied man. And what he's trying to show you here is that there's both a stone of cursing as well as bread of life that is attached to the commandments of the Torah. You can keep it and eat the bread of life, or you can refuse it and you can have a stone of cursing. See, if we ask God for bread, He doesn't give us a stone of cursing. If we're obedient. If we're disobedient to what He told us, then He might give us a stone until we get hungry enough that we're ready for the bread of life. I don't know how many stones I could actually eat before I would be ready for the bread of life. But that first covenant life involved man's intrinsic nature as a worker. Adam was put in the garden to work. Avodah. To work. Psychologically, emotionally, physically, mankind is designed to be busy tending the Father's kingdom because he was made in the image of Elohim, who is first described to us in the Torah as one who worked. We don't hear about his rest until the seventh day. For 6 days we hear all about his work, his malakah. It means an occupation, something you're working at. And then he turns around and he tells Adam to also avad, to work, and to shamar, to keep it and to maintain it. If an able-bodied man does not work for and guard his family, then he is in violation of the first covenant, not just the Mosaic and the renewed covenant. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Maybe this commandment to the Thessalonians was a mistake. Maybe we're taking it out of context. Look at 1 Timothy 5:8. It says, if any man provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Denied the faith? He said it's just like you denied Yeshua if you won't get up and go get a job and provide for your family. Why is he saying it like this? Why can't he just say like Solomon, get up, lazy bones, and go look at the ants and get a job? Paul's being much harsher. He's saying it's just as if we had never professed our faith in Messiah Yeshua. Why? Because an infidel makes no claim to a covenant. He doesn't. That's not where he is. But one who claims to be in covenant is one who is obligated to imitate the Heavenly Father's ways, and he is not an infidel. Our Father in heaven is not an infidel. Therefore, in our behavior, we have to imitate Him. We have to provide for our families too, as an example to others that this is the way that our Abba treats His children. Covenant men are to be an example. They are to be a light. They are to work with diligence to provide for their families. And Scripture says this includes his wife, his children, his parents, and even a widowed aunt who has no other source of support. It's your family, and they need help. You're obligated to help them. He says, don't put that on the congregation. Now, do you think that it's any harder to make a living today than it was in the first century when those words were written? I think it's probably a whole lot easier to make daily bread today than it was in the first century. So what about women? What's she supposed to do? Well, she's supposed to do what 1 Timothy chapter 5 says. Torah establishes a woman's primary responsibility is her home and her husband. That's her primary responsibility. Because in the same breath in which Adam was told that he would now earn his bread through toil and sweat, Eve, Chava, is now told that she is going to bear children in pain. That's the corresponding thing to Adam's toil and work. What does that mean? Well, her primary responsibility is going to be building the home. It's going to, as a helper to Adam, as he's out in the field toiling and working, she's going to make sure that that home is also tended and cared for and kept. And it's also going to be done in a degree of unpleasantness, in pain. You raise your children. You don't just have pain one time when you have children. Their entire lives, you are in pain, in agony over where they are, what they're doing. Are they safe? Are they okay? Are they making good decisions? That's the torment of a parent. That's the pain of a parent, is always worrying about your children. And that is an especial challenge to women, because women tend to worry more over their children. So, you have to watch them grow in an environment of sin, the same environment of sin that brought forth thorns and thistles. It's going to bring emotional pain. And I don't think anything's changed for mothers since this was said to Eve. Mothers still worry over their children. They grieve over them as they grow and struggle with the weeds and thorns of fallen creation. So Paul's instructions to Timothy echo these words. He says, I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, and give no occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Now, how in the world would bearing children, guiding the house, prevent the adversary from assaulting her with harmful words? Think about that. He says, but the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Yeshua, they will marry, having damnation because they cast off their first faith. And they learn to be idle, wandering from house to house, and not only idle, but they're tattlers. They're busybodies, and they're saying things that they shouldn't. Now here Paul is not speaking against a widow remarrying, far from it. He says, I want them to remarry. But, he says, I want them to follow the example that was laid down in the Torah covenant. We are a kingdom of priests, and we are not to marry just anyone. We are not to form relationships with just anyone. He says, be careful about supporting a young widow, because we're a kingdom of priests. And if you're a young widow, and you have been with a man, and you have had that comfort, and that is snatched away from you, it is very hard to live without that security, with that emotional support. All the things that a man was designed to be in our lives. And he said, pretty soon they'll be like this man that I'm calling an infidel who won't work. She will also be unfaithful to Messiah Yeshua. She will not trust him, and she will turn to any man who will give her that safety and security, whether he is in or out of the covenant. He's saying that her actions, if she turns and marries a man who is outside of the covenant, who is a stranger to the covenant, then that is not a good yoke to take upon herself. She has yoked herself to something other than the kingdom. And he says it's a source of damnation or cursing to be yoked with that unbeliever, because they've cast off their first faith, which was in Yeshua, and they did not have the faith in Yeshua to provide them with that covenant husband. Marriage to an unbeliever when you know better. Now, a lot of people were married when they didn't know better. But if you know better now, you have to do better. And if you were to lose your husband, or even if you were in a dating relationship, you should not be flirting with unbelievers. If Yeshua is not number one on their priority list, he can't be number two, he can't be number three. If Yeshua is not number one on his priority list, he is not for you. He might be for someone else, but he is not for you, because Paul is saying that that is equal to denying the covenant. It's the same thing as a man who won't go out and work and provide for his family. Now, what am I saying here about primary responsibilities? The man's to go out to make the living and the woman's just to stay home? Primarily. Yes. If it involves child raising, that was the one commonality, is that they would raise children. But we also have some other things to look at that give us more understanding. It says the woman is to guide the children. It says that in Proverbs more than once, that she is to teach the children the Torah. Does that mean men don't? Anybody awake?
Yeah.
Men do teach children.
Yeah.
That's what the Shema says. And they show them another side of the Torah as they teach it. With your mother, it's going to be a Torah of kindness usually. With your father, it may not be a Torah of kindness all the time. It might be a Torah of discipline. It might bring balance to the mercy of the Torah. But the husband does assist the wife in guiding and teaching the children in the home. Just as if we were to read Proverbs 31, we can see that a woman assists her husband in earning an income. That woman was not a stay-at-home mom. That was her primary responsibility. It says the first thing she did in the day was take care of her family. But then as it goes on, it describes things like going out to a field, considering this field, buying this field, planting this field with the work of her own hand, going and selling things in the marketplace. So she is not precluded from working. If you start to box things up too much, you'll take the spirit out of the Torah. These things are open to her as long as her primary responsibility and obligation toward her children is kept. What if somebody like me, I can't have children? Do you want me to sit home and eat bonbons all day? Now, some days it sounds like a really good deal. Sounds like a deal. But no, according to the Torah, there is to be work. There is to be gleaning. There is to be participation. I am to help my husband any way I can. And even if I don't have physical children, then when I go out and work, I earn an income with which I can support spiritual children. You do what you can with what you have. We have to be diligent. Whatever we do, we have to be diligent so that we don't repeat a mistake that was made back at the very beginning. What do you think Eve was doing when the serpent walked up to her? Remember, he had legs back then. I don't know, what he looked like, but he walks up to her and strikes up a conversation. But it's an idle conversation. Maybe she should have been working. Maybe she should have been helping Adam in the garden. I don't know. But you never know when you're idle, when you're using those idle words, if there's a serpent on the other end of the phone. A Proverbs woman, it says, has a Torah of kindness on her tongue. She's not going to pick up that phone to spread bad news. She's not going to go to her neighbor's house to spread bad news. She's not going to let the serpent in her house to give her bad news. She's going to run him off. She's going to protect her children. She's going to protect her home. Paul would probably shudder today if he knew how easy it was to pick up a phone and go from house to house as a busybody. I mean, we don't have to walk 1 inch. All we have to do is pick up the phone to be a busybody. For men who don't work, for women who neglect their own family responsibilities to go from house to house that way, Paul says you're a busybody. And I looked it up. What is a busybody? Heard it all my life, didn't really know what it was. It says it's someone who inserts himself into other people's affairs. Remember, I don't have a dog in that fight. You stick your hand in a dog fight, they'll both bite you. If it's not your affair, leave it alone. But if you're bored, it's awful tempting to get in somebody else's business. Why? Because the stuff we go through at work every day, the drama just of being at work and all the stuff that goes on that keeps us active, that keeps us moving, keeps us, our adrenaline pumping throughout the day. If you're sitting at the house, you're going to get it some way. Have you ever engaged in a little bit of gossip and you got high on it? Yeah. There's something that happens to you chemically, physiologically. When you engage in gossip and bad talk, when you hear the latest juicy tidbit, you're going to get off on it. Instead of being at work and enjoying the reward that comes from work and struggling against those challenges in a positive way and overcoming, and that good feeling you get when you solve a problem at work, they're trying to duplicate that same feeling, but they're doing it in a negative way. They busy themselves with becoming wise in other people's affairs. And you know what the serpent says? A lie. He tells them a big fat lie. He says that eating the fruit of idleness will make us wise. Yeah, it'll make you wise. Make you wise in something you don't need to know. That's the knowledge of evil. And the most common snare is that we tell ourselves we're going to be a peacemaker in this situation. We're going to get all the information and we're going to try to fix this up where these people will make peace. But that's a very subtle lie that we tell ourselves, because all it is an excuse to taste a forbidden fruit that gives us the knowledge of evil. And we learn things we don't need to know. And over time, you can become addicted to this fruit. I've seen people do it. They become addicted to gossip and bad news. They go from vineyard to vineyard, tasting from as many fields as they possibly can, and they become intoxicated with that gossip, but they're neglecting their own vineyard. It's possible, however, even if you work hard, and I've seen this happen, you can work full-time at a job, at school, at raising children, and you can still be a busybody. It's usually somebody we know at work who always has the latest gossip, right? If you want something spread, make sure you say it in front of them, and you know it'll be all over the place. It'll probably be all over the county before the workday's over, because that's who they are. They eat the bread of idleness. How do they have time to do their job and stay on the phone spreading bad news, gathering all this information and then putting it back out? You know how they get it? They steal it. They steal the time from their employers. They steal the time from their families. And most importantly, they are stealing that time from the kingdom of heaven. They are stealing. Gossiping, remember, is to look upon somebody's nakedness. It's to lift up their skirt and look at their weakness and their shortcomings. And the proverb says, don't go to your neighbor's wife with all this gossip. That's what you're doing when you entertain it. It's just like you took your neighbor's wife and you lifted her skirt and wanted a peek. That's how awful it is. You wouldn't do that. So why would you gossip? It's adultery. Evil talk is also a sin of evil congregations like Ammon and Moab. Even if these busybodies had twice as much work to do, it would not slow down their adultery. Because remember, they're just going to steal the time somewhere else. They have not understood the words of the preacher, which are, because God is in heaven and you are on earth, therefore let your words be few. You don't need that many. So that brings us back to the Torah portion. Who are these widows, orphans, and strangers that we are obligated to leave the gleanings? Number one, it's your immediate family. It's your blood relatives. And then your congregational family. How do I know this? Because one of the last things Yeshua did on that tree was find Mary a new son and John a new mother. I don't know why James wasn't given that responsibility, but for some reason he chose one of his apostles to become Mary's son. So it's your physical family, it's your spiritual family. There are those who are indeed dependent upon others for bread, shelter, and clothing. Indeed, not in choice. We can choose not to work. We also have to include in this a traveler. We are obligated to provide for a traveler. Why? Because they might be an angel. They seem to stay on the road a lot. We might be entertaining an angel unaware. As people pass through here, let's provide for them. This does not include an able-bodied man who refuses to work at gleaning. It does not include an able-bodied woman, even if she's a widow, who will not work. Even though she's under the protection of a near relative, she has an obligation to help build the home in which she lives by diligent work of her hands. And finally, the stranger. Who's the stranger? It's somebody who's come to sojourn with us. They're not really in there with the covenant yet. There's a lot of stuff that's still strange to them. They're learning the covenant, but there's a lot of stuff. They've just not had time to learn it yet. They've not accepted that covenant fully. They're like Cornelius. They're full of good deeds, but they just don't know it all yet. They're learning. They're beginning to practice some of the commandments of the Torah. But we know it takes time. In some respects, we're a stranger too, because we don't know all the Torah. We don't know how to practice it. We're still learning too. So there's parts of this covenant sometimes that still seem strange to us. We're in the learning process. So we need to be kind to those who are just beginning to learn and patient. They take one commandment at a time, one morsel of living bread at a time. Just like if you walked into a gold mine, there's no way I could get all this gold out of this mine and take it home today. Does that mean you would walk away and not take anything? Or would you hack out a little piece to carry off? That's what we're all doing. We're hacking off pieces of this that we can actually take and use today, and we're carrying it off. We're going to mine the gold out of God's Word that we can carry for today. That's who the stranger is. It's people we bring in until they learn to incorporate the commandments into their lives. And this stranger can join us at our pilgrimage festivals, eating tithes and offerings, sharing the bread of life. And you know, as they consume that bread of life, they're going to kind of get spoiled, because that's good stuff. The Torah is good stuff. It tastes good. It says, taste and see. Adonai is good. And they're going to eat our summer fruits with us. And we're not going to be naughty figs. We're going to be good figs. We're going to be good fruit. We're going to have the fruit of the Spirit. And you know what they're going to say? That unclean food I've been eating, it just doesn't sit well with my stomach anymore. I don't want that. And you know what? I know a naughty fig when I taste one, and I don't want that either. I want this good fruit. I want the first fruits. I want the cream of the crop. I want to share in the body of Messiah. That's how we're going to entice that stranger to join into a covenant community. And when they say that, I want to be in the covenant, sign me up, at that point they share a place with sons and daughters, because the covenant is no longer considered a strange thing. It's part of them. Then you have someone who is marriage material. Then you have someone who is marriage material. If you are dating, if you are hooked up with somebody who thinks the Torah covenant is strange, you're in a dangerous place. Because you're asking for trouble. You're asking for misery. They're still a stranger to it. I'm not saying they're not saved. Might be a good Christian. But I'm saying if the Torah covenant is strange to them and it's a part of you, you're asking for trouble. Until that time where it is no longer considered strange to them, we let them glean. We let them glean from the Torah. But it says we are not to marry them or even enter into a contract with them. Did you hear those first words of Proverbs? It says, my son, if you have given surety, given your hand for a stranger, if you have co-signed something for a stranger, you've made a mistake. Because they're not in yet. They're on the fringe. They're out there. They're moving. They're thinking. But you cannot predict at that point, when the smoke clears, whether they will be in the covenant or outside of it. So he says, if you've co-signed for this stranger before they have been made a fellow citizen, then you do whatever it takes. If you read that word in Hebrew, it means you raise Cain until they let you out of that contract. That would mean you're down there banging on the door of the bank every day till they just say, here, we'll take your name off. You don't have any rest till you disengage from that relationship with the stranger. It's foolish to do it, because you don't know yet whether they will make a covenant partner. You never commit your life to one who thinks the Torah strange. So let's take from this a desire to evaluate our words. Our words are our fruit, right? Have you ever known anybody that was so wise that they didn't have to really be talking about anything great or grand? It's just wisdom fell out of their mouths. No matter what they said, it was wisdom. It was perfectly timed. It was apt. It was right on target. And you just wanted to be a gleaner that followed after them, and you picked up those words as they fell, because even the gleanings of those words from that wise person, it was like first fruits to you. That's what we need to be. We need to be those wise people that even the gleanings that fall out of our mouths over insignificant things, just workaday things, nothings, even the nothings that come out of our mouths are valuable. It's gold. It's first fruits. It's cream of the crop because they've never had anything better. Are we speaking our words as though we will be judged according to the fruit that comes out? Are we sharing healing words, or are we busybodies lifting skirts to look upon one another's weaknesses and failings? We are going to give an account for every idle word. It would be nice if a few could be overlooked. But as I think back over my life, 40-something years, and I think of all the idle words that I've ever spoken, that I will someday have to explain them to a judge. And why I said them. I am going to wish at that point, why didn't I believe the preacher when he said, because God is in heaven and you are on earth, let your words be few. Why couldn't I just speak a few words that were good fruit instead of a lot of words that were a mixture of the good figs and the naughty figs? Let's resolve to make even the gleanings of our words acceptable before the judge, because we never know when there's a hungry person standing around. They're hungry for something. They need Yeshua, and something absolutely filthy comes out of our mouths. Gossip is filthy. It's pornography. It's spiritual pornography. And they were hungry, and they were waiting. And what fell out was something they didn't need to know about someone else. You didn't feed them. You turned them away with a closed fist. You say, don't come and knock on my door anymore, or I'll give you more unclean words. Our gleanings need to fill people's spirits to make them glad. It's joy. It's peace that should come out of our mouths. Healing words that should drop out. Things that make them better, not things that make them sick. You've heard words before that just made you sick to your stomach. Worse than any bad food you ever ate. You were sick in your spirit that your ears heard that. And you wanted to vomit it back up before it had a chance to process. Let those types of words never come out of our mouths. Let us comfort our family, our congregational family, the needy and the stranger. And let us always drop those good gleanings behind us.
Welcome to Israelnet.tv.